Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue with another chapter here from the Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of X-Investigations book by Bob Johnson. I'm still having a fun time sharing these chapters, reading them here and then seeing what your views and comments are on it afterward. This one is going to be a fan favorite because it has to do with werewolves. A lot of people love my stories on werewolves there on my Cryptids and Monsters videos. And the fact that I was reading some of these passages and it talks about shape-shifting werewolves, well, I definitely wanted to share it here. So I'm going to go ahead and feature part 1 of chapter 4, and then I'll do part 2 as another video soon. And as always, I'll put my own thoughts and comments on it afterward, and I love to hear what yours are there. But the title of this particular chapter is The Werewolf of Van Nuys. So let's go ahead and let's share this chapter here, and then I'll continue part 2 again on another video soon. So here's essentially what was written. While I was sipping my coffee in Vincent's office, Silvana dropped some newspaper clippings on my desk. Although X Investigations was officially affiliated with the private detectives company, our office consisted of a desk, a chair, a file cabinet, and a telephone. Vincent's rationale, which I fully understood, was that until the division became profitable, we had to be mean and lean. And he also made sure that we didn't have any of our kooky Ghostbuster materials lying around where his regular clients might see them. So out of habit, I immediately picked up the clippings Savannah had dropped and was ready to toss them in my basket when a headline from a local Southern California free circulation paper grabbed my attention. It read, "Werewolf plagues local residents." Even in our line of work, the word werewolf rarely pops up in our reading matter, and I couldn't remember ever seeing a reference to werewolves in any newspaper, so I grabbed the clip and started reading about how the residents of an area in Van Nuys reported first-hand accounts of a half-man, half-animal creature that stalked the backyards of a bedroom community, killing small animals and howling at the moon. Normally, we couldn't take on an investigation unless we were solicited, but the more I read about this werewolf, the more intriguing the story became. What really piqued my curiosity was that the reporter on the local paper actually did his homework in the study of lycanthropy, from a Greek word leukos for wolf and anthropos for man, a field most people erroneously believe is the study of werewolves. However, it's a broader term that describes the interest in a psychological condition where people believe themselves to be animals of many kinds and sometimes adorn themselves with animal skins and teeth. Now, the reporter described how the locals told of a shape-shifting man in his 30s or 40s who they at first see walking upright and then gradually bending at the waist until he appeared to be walking on all fours. The interesting part came from the reporter's accounts of how the eyewitnesses described a distinct canine odor that permeated the air whenever this half-man was spotted. The story also told of wet spots that appeared to be pools of drool that were found on the ground. Usual Bigfoot-type spottings rarely mention anything but the visual sighting, and even then the accounts are far from accurate and in most cases vary from one person to another. But in this Van Nuys incident, over 40 residents of the area were interviewed, some sought out and some volunteers, and they all described the werewolf in the exact same terms, mentioning the canine smells and pools of copious drool. The size of the man, the crouching, the bushiness of his hair, and even dead chickens and small pets that were mangled and torn were all corroborated by the reporter's sources. It was just the kind of story that the mainstream newspapers would purposely ignore, thinking it was fabricated by a bunch of publicity seekers and would give a legitimate paper a bad name. And normally I myself would think it was nothing more than sensationalism. But when I asked Savannah for her opinion, she said something that started us off on one of the most unusual cases X Investigations have ventured into. She said the story pointed out that most of the people who reported the creature were Mexican American, normally a very religious group, and for them to embrace a werewolf mythos was very unusual. Savannah said, these people are typically Roman Catholic and do not easily talk about strange occurrences, and almost all werewolf legends originated in Northern Europe and had no Spanish influence. Any talk of half-man, half-animal creatures is extremely sacrilegious and is believed to be the devil's work. I believe, Robert, that if 40 people were willing to speak of such a thing and risk sinning against God, then there must be something to the phenomenon. I'm afraid that it is real. Despite the fact that we had no contact in Van Nuys and we weren't being paid for our services, Silvana and I caught a plane to Los Angeles the next day. I felt that whatever we found in Van Nuys, whether it was a bona fide paranormal occurrence or not, we would gather useful background information for our files in the event we ever ran into such a case in the future. And as always in our investigations, we had a gut feeling there was something strange happening in this middle-class American community. So strange that it had a number of residents acting like horror movie buffs. That was all we needed to justify our trip. Silvana and I stayed at a Best Western near Interstate 405 in Van Nuys, about a mile from the newspaper's headquarters. We were expecting it to be typically bright and sunny in Los Angeles, but we hit town smack in the middle of the weather phenomenon called El Niño, which dumped days and days of rain on the otherwise pleasant environment. The locals were not accustomed to the gloom, and we were definitely not in the best of moods. It seemed fitting that we were investigating werewolves in this dark and dank setting. We wondered if perhaps the weather had somehow had an eerie causative effect on people typically accustomed to the bright and sunny California sun. But Jim Mitchell, the reporter for the Valley Voice who wrote that story, sounded cheery enough on the phone when I contacted him while we were still in New York to ask if he would be willing to guide us around in our investigation. Jim was more than happy to hear from us. He had taken a lot of heat from the story from his peers and was grateful that someone actually believed his work. So after arriving at Los Angeles International, I wasted no time in calling the paper to set up an appointment with Jim. When I asked for Jim, the newspaper receptionist said, "Oh, you want the Wolf Boy." Mitchell was clearly getting it from all angles, so I immediately tried to make him feel that at least we were on his side. "Hi, Jim. Don't be bothered by those types. They're closed-minded, and they can't conceive of anything that exists outside of a Terminator movie," I said. I went on to explain that Silvana and I were eager to get moving on that case and wanted to speak to some of the witnesses. Silvana reminded me to ask if anyone had mentioned the full moon aspect of the werewolf sightings. Jim said that no one had, which confirmed in Silvana's mind that this wasn't a gigantic hoax. That would have been the first thing they would have said if this was a trick. It is so common and fits with the legend. It looks for real to me, Silvana said. But I pointed out that the area was socked in with overcast skies, and if it was a hoax, they wouldn't be able to explain how they knew it was a full moon. You don't have to see the moon to know it is full, Robert. Just read the newspaper, look at a calendar, or go on the internet, Silvana replied. I was again reminded why I needed a partner. And so we arranged to meet Jim at a local coffee shop to discuss the case before we met any of his star witnesses. He told us that there were two sisters who were the most vocal and articulate and who happened to have seen the alleged werewolf on more than one occasion. They lived about a quarter of a mile apart, so their testimony allowed us to construct a geographic area that we could stake out. Jim explained that both of these women had seen the creature numerous times and had supplied the most graphic descriptions of its appearance. I asked if they seemed to be normal, everyday people, and if there was anything about their behavior or background that would have made Jim think they might have just be bored housewives looking for a different kind of gossip thrill. But Jim assured me that both Carrie and Josie were as normal as could be and were upstanding citizens in their community with good jobs. Carrie was a nurse and Josie was a caterer, and there was no record of them ever participating in anything even remotely bizarre. That's when Silvana chimed in and asked if they were religious people. All of the families in this Mexican community are religious Catholics, most of them, Jim answered. Silvana nodded to me, and I recognized that look in her eyes that meant we were about to embark on a juicy case. Jim called Carrie from the coffee shop and asked when we could meet. She was concerned about who we were, but Jim assured her that we wanted to get to the bottom of the strange goings-on, and so she agreed. It was about 7 p.m. on a Friday, and Carrie told Jim that we could come over right away. As we drove down the street to Carrie's house, we could have been on any suburban American block. All of the houses were standard California ranch style with large front lawns and two-car garages. Everything seemed normal except for the distinct absence of playing children and barking dogs. It was oddly quiet, too quiet. When we arrived at Carrie's yellow and white home at the end of the cul-de-sac, she was already at the front door waving hello. After we made our formal introductions, I politely asked, "Carrie, I noticed there is no barking on this street. In fact, I haven't seen one pet or children play outdoors for that matter." She looked at Jim and told me that since the sightings of the werewolf man, children and pets were kept indoors after dusk. Some small pets have disappeared, and a neighbor who raises chickens, which is not uncommon for our people, has had many killed. "We are not taking any chances," Carrie said. I asked Carrie to describe in detail what she had seen and when she first saw the werewolf of Van Nuys. "I was bringing my children home from open school night about 6 weeks ago. It was just about the time El Niño started, so it was very foggy and damp. My son Jorge asked if we could go to the local soccer field before we came home to find the ball he had left there earlier today. He said he didn't think anyone could have taken it because he kicked it in some bushes under the trees over at the edge of the park. So I agreed to go with him, and we walked into the small forest area to find his ball. But just as Jorge was picking up his ball, I heard some rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I thought it was a cat or maybe a squirrel or possum, but it looked very large and made a lot of noise. I became frightened and grabbed Jorge's hand and started to run. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I had to look back at what now appeared to be the big hairy back of an animal that was crouched over. I had never seen anything that large. At first I thought it was a bear. I couldn't help myself and I let out a gasp, and that's when it happened. "What happened?" Silvana and I asked in unison. When I gasped, the thing raised up on two legs like a man but covered in hair. It turned its head to look at me. Carrie had to stop to compose herself, but I pressed her to continue. The face was not a man's. It had yellow eyes and it was drooling. It looked like the face of a German shepherd dog, but I believe it was a wolf. My first impulse was to ask Carrie how she could have possibly thought she saw a man with a wolf's body and face, but I opted instead to ask if she wasn't sure that maybe someone was playing a trick on people by running around in a werewolf costume. She said that she knew the difference, and the terror had a lot more to do with the entire scenario and not just the creature's appearance. She mentioned the odor, like a wet dog, and the growling guttural noise that came from the creature's mouth. These were not sounds that could have been made by a man. I grew up with many animals, and I know the difference between a human sound and an animal's, Carrie said. It is also the hair that we found caught on the bushes when we returned the next day. It was very coarse, like a dog's. I asked if the hair had been analyzed. Carrie said it hadn't, but that she had saved a clump. I immediately instructed Silvana to locate a lab and get us some results. I asked Jim why he hadn't followed up himself, since positive results would have added credence to the story. He told me that at the time, Carrie wouldn't part with it. Now she said, "I can only give it to someone who I feel really believes in what we saw that night. There are many strange things that happen in the world, and the unbelievers will only think I am crazy. I feel you know about things that can't be explained." As we drove away from Carrie's house, I thought that this was turning out to be an interesting investigation. I couldn't recall the last time I read or even heard about a werewolf sighting or a case of psychological lycanthropy, no less one that was reported by dozens of people. I was anxious to get the results of the hair analysis, so we dropped Silvana off at a lab that Jim recommended in downtown LA and drove on to interview another key witness to the sighting, a professor at the Northridge campus of the California State University. Sam Glassick, a natural sciences instructor, was the most down-to-earth person imaginable. I was immediately struck by his articulate and sophisticated manner after Jim introduced us. I knew that if anyone we interviewed would be skeptical and able to give us an unbiased and factual account of what he saw, it would be Sam. In fact, the first thing he said to me was that he was glad to meet us, but that he really didn't believe in the paranormal or the occult, and he hoped we could find a logical explanation for his account. My wife thinks I'm drinking that night after my classes, but I know what I saw, and it is strange indeed, he said. It seemed odd that in the midst of a vibrant college campus where we're all talking about the possibility of a wild man-beast running around a metropolitan area, but that's one incident that makes X Investigations the fascinating entity it is. We handle the kooky, the absurd, the far out, and the unbelievable cases that almost no regular authority would touch. Unless there's a murder or report of abuse, the police and even bona fide academics will not pursue the strange and unexplained. Aside from using some psychics in police murder cases, employing the paranormal is considered nutty and a waste of time. But there are thousands of unsolved police cases that are currently open without explanation. Savannah and I both know or knew when we began our venture that we would be perceived as the stuff of TV and movies, but we also knew that we had an instinctive, inherent need and drive, a calling that allowed us to put logic aside and open our minds to what seems to be impossible. We had both done this from an early age, and it has opened our eyes. Once they are open, they can never be closed. I recognized that in Sam's eyes, that his eyes were now open, and he didn't know how to deal with it. It was our job to welcome him aboard. First off, Professor, you'll be happy to know that there have been a number of witnesses who not only saw what you saw, but have actual hard evidence to back it up. We're analyzing a clump of hair right now that could set the stage for this entire investigation, I said. Sam smiled and said that made him feel a little better, and then he told us his story. He had been leaving his last class one evening about 10 p.m. He had to park fairly far from the building where the class was held because he had arrived late in the day. The pathway to the car lot cut through an open field and then through a patch of trees and temporary steel picnic tables. As Sam headed toward the lot, he saw someone running in the distance about 200 yards in front of him. He thought at first that it was someone chasing after his dog because he heard a low growling and barking sound. As the shadowed figure moved closer, Sam said it looked as if it was running bent at the waist. He thought maybe the man held a dog's leash and that was causing him to bend over. But as he got closer, about 25 yards away, the creature streaked from side to side in and out of the trees, and Sam was shocked to see that it was very hairy and its head was quite pointed. It was its face that really spooked me. I thought it was some kind of motorcycle helmet at first because the front of his head had an elongated nose. Sometimes these helmets have that shape. But then I noticed the flowing hair, not only on the head, but on the body as well. So I knew it wasn't a helmet at all. It was the thing's head. And as I got closer, I was transfixed. It saw me, stopped, and stared right at me. I was really freaked out when it looked straight at me, Sam said. And then that's it. Let me go ahead and I'll pause it here for part 1 of chapter 4, The Werewolf at Van Nuys, from the book Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of X Investigations. Good little way, good little teaser to end on here. Interesting stuff, right? When it comes to this story involving werewolves. Who knew that somewhere there in California, in Van Nuys, here you have a situation where there's a local werewolf. So much so that people are describing incidences involving lost pets, incidences involving lost cattle, or some, in this case from the form of chickens. Also people seeing multiple witnesses, over a dozen, with the fact that they're seeing something like this. It looks human-like, half man, half werewolf, or half dog, a shape of a man, but it's hairy, and then most distinctly it has the face of an actual wolf or an actual dog itself. And now we're talking about several witnesses that the investigators themselves, Bob Johnson and Silvana, are talking with, who had seen this creature. And this creature is having an effect so much that in those communities, it's causing both the children and the pets to stay indoor to make sure that everyone else is safe. Fascinating stuff. I would love to see what happens afterward with part 2, as it turns out, like who essentially this could be. At the beginning, I was thinking it could be more on the lines of that lycanthropy, as he was stating, where it's people thinking that they're animals, but they're still humans. Like obviously they don't have elongated heads, or they don't have full sets of hair throughout their entire body like fur. But no, in this case, now we have 2 people explaining that their investigation is taking them to. They're explaining about those half man, half wolves, half dogs type creatures, and that's the real deal. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is explained away afterward. But let me know what you guys think. Post those comments below. Love to hear what your thoughts are with regards to this werewolf tale. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.